Cars are great. They have revolutionized transportation around the world. They've made it possible for people to travel long distances quickly, they offer easier access to remote areas, and they enable a more efficient transport of goods. For many, cars symbolize independence, success, and adventure. So it's not surprising that cars have become a critical part of modern society. And yet, if you spend any time in urbanist circles, you'll find people who want to take away car lanes, tear down highways, make cars drive slower, and even remove cars completely from many places. So why do these car-hating urbanists want to destroy our freedoms? Well, I can't speak for all urbanists, but I don't actually want to eliminate cars. I don't own a car today simply because I live in a place that makes it unnecessary, but I do have a driver's license and I drive whenever I need to. So it's not that I hate cars, it's just that I love cities. And the fact is that cars ruin cities. So when you ruin the cities I love, then yeah, I'm going to have a problem with that. So let's talk about all the ways that cars harm cities, the environment, and people's lives, and maybe by the end of this video, you might hate cars just a little bit too. This is a paper published by UK researchers in 2024 entitled Car Harm: A Global Review of Automobility's Harm to People and the Environment. It's a comprehensive summary of all of the harm caused by motor vehicles that can be backed up by scientific evidence, which is a great place to get us started. I'm going to go over the key ideas in this paper and bring in other research as necessary. As usual, all references are available at the link in the description. Cars can be very convenient for an individual, but they create a lot of problems for society that are ultimately paid for by everyone, regardless of whether or not they drive a motor vehicle. This is what economists refer to as externalities, the classic example being pollution. If a factory pollutes the local water supply, then everybody using that water is negatively affected, but the factory owner doesn't experience these health or financial costs, and in many cases, even benefits from not having to properly dispose of their pollution. Which is why one of the primary roles of government is to minimize the effects of externalities on the rest of society. The Car Harm paper categorizes the externalities of motor vehicles into 7 main categories, and we'll get to all of them eventually, but let's start with the biggest problem of them all. Cars kill people. A lot of people, and the statistics from the WHO in the Car Harm paper are horrifying. They estimate that traffic crashes kill 1.3 million people each year and are the leading cause of death for people between the ages of 4 and 30. The authors estimate that between 60 to 80 million people have been killed by cars since their invention, which would make cars as deadly as literal World War II, but deaths only tell part of the story. The paper estimates that in the past 25 years, over 2 billion people have been injured in motor vehicle crashes, and in some cases, injuries from a car crash result in lifelong disabilities. Cars were becoming safer over the past few decades, and deaths and injuries from crashes were decreasing. But then the automobile industry discovered they could make a lot more money selling giant SUVs and pickup trucks instead of regular cars, and so now deaths and injuries are going up. Because of their heavy and tall designs, SUVs and pickup trucks cause more deaths and injuries, especially to other people outside of the vehicle. This includes people in smaller cars, but especially people who are walking and cycling. In the EU, road deaths have decreased by 36% since 2010, but in the US, road deaths have increased by 30% during the same time period. Worse, pedestrian deaths in the US have increased by 80% since 2010, and they are now at the highest level they've been since the 1980s. Meanwhile, EU pedestrian deaths have dropped 37% since 2010. So no, it's not just because of the phones. They have iPhones in Europe too, but what they don't have in Europe are passenger vehicles as big as literal tanks. And I have a previous video about that if you'd like to learn more. We often talk about traffic deaths as accidents, but the majority of road deaths are preventable, which is why many safe street advocates are pressuring news and governmental organizations to use the term crash instead of accident when reporting car crashes. We know that road deaths can be reduced significantly with safer street design and, most importantly, lower speed limits, which is why many cities are reducing their default speed limit to 30 kilometers per hour, and I have a previous video about that if you'd like to learn more. The paper also provides examples of how cars are used as intentional weapons in drive-by shootings, car bombs, or intentional crashes, and they note that hundreds of cities have been forced to install bollards to fortify public spaces against vehicle attacks. They also reference the thousands of deaths per year from intentional car crashes and carbon monoxide inhalation from car exhaust as methods for self-harm. Cars are dangerous, but they also dominate urban life, and so everyone needs to be alert and aware of the dangers of cars every time they go out in the city. I was glad to see the paper talk about how every time you cross the street, you're engaging in a life and death decision process, and I have a whole video about that if you'd like to learn more. Yes, I made a 30-minute video about crossing the street, but it's worth it, if only for these stupid flags. Of course, these are just the obvious ways that cars kill people. If you're lucky enough to avoid a serious crash, cars will still play the long game, killing you slowly over time. If you live in a place with pollution from cars, such as nitrogen dioxide, sulfur dioxide, ozone, and particulate matter, you're at a higher risk of death from basically everything. And in case you're skeptical, the paper has references for every one of these assertions. For example, this systematic review of 353 studies that shows that motor vehicle air pollution is associated with all-cause circulatory, ischemic heart disease, and lung cancer mortality. It takes decades to understand the full impact of the harms caused by environmental pollutants. Like, we are still trying to understand the full scope of the societal impact of leaded gasoline. This meta-analysis published in 2022 estimates that the phase-out of leaded gasoline was responsible for up to 28% of the steep fall in homicide rates from 1989 to 2014, especially in urban areas. I remember suburbanites in the 90s saying they would never live in the city because there was too much crime. Turns out their cars were part of the problem. Of all of the world's major cities, Paris might be doing the most to curb car traffic. They have removed cars from major streets, built hundreds of kilometers of bicycle lanes, and even converted a highway into a walking and cycling path, and I made a video about those improvements a few years ago. The non-profit organization Air Paris collects pollution data in Paris, and you can see the drastic improvements that these changes have made. For decades, Parisians were inhaling an enormous amount of unnecessary air pollutants simply because they allowed their city to be overrun by cars. Now the city and people's lungs are finally starting to heal, and other cities are starting to take notice. Of course, the automobile industry's answer to this is electric cars, which are an improvement, but they only resolve part of the problem because tailpipe exhaust is only one source of pollution from cars. Cars release hundreds of environmental pollutants from sources such as brakes, vehicle corrosion, lubricating oils, and the erosion of asphalt and road markings. The car harm paper also notes that even though lead has been banned in gasoline, there is still lead in many automobile paints, and many road markings contain high levels of lead as well, especially yellow paint. But how often is yellow used in road markings, right? One of the biggest issues, though, is tires. Cars are constantly wearing away at their tires and the road surface as they drive. This toxic road dust is then spread into the environment by rainwater or blown into the air by passing vehicles. And since electric cars are heavier than gas cars, they do this even faster. You may have heard about microplastics or nanoplastics, extremely small particles of plastic that have been found nearly everywhere in our environment, including inside of our brains and other organs. Whenever microplastics are discussed, it's usually blamed on fast fashion or disposable plastic utensils, and we all need to drink from these stupid paper straws as a result. But what is rarely talked about is car tires, even though they're a major source of microplastics. This 2017 study calculated that tires and road wear particles, or TRWP, were the single largest source of microplastics in European rivers. which makes sense because very few of us are rubbing plastic straws along the ground at 100 kilometers per hour. In this 2025 paper, researchers in Leipzig tested urban air for microplastics and nanoplastics and found that 65% of particles came from tire wear. The paper goes on to reference research about how these kinds of small particles increase the risk of death from lung cancer and cardiovascular disease. What's worse is that we don't know exactly what tires are made of because the formulas are considered a trade secret by tire manufacturers. So yeah, we're all drinking and breathing in car tires, and we have no idea what's in them. In the 1980s, researchers in the US were investigating a massive die-off in coho salmon. After decades of research, they discovered that this was due to a byproduct of 6-PPD, a rubber stabilizer used in car tires. More recent studies have shown that 6-PPD is toxic to other fish species as well, but despite this, it is still being used in car tires today. I learned about this from this book, Life After Cars, written by the hosts of the War on Cars podcast. It's a great read, and I can definitely recommend it. I'll leave a link to their website in the description if you'd like to learn more. Cars are by far the primary source of noise pollution in cities. At speeds of over 30 kilometers per hour, the loudest part of a car isn't the engine, it's the sound of the tires on the road, what's referred to as rolling noise. And since electric cars are heavier than gas cars, they are even louder when driven at higher speeds, which is yet another reason for speed limits to be 30 kilometers per hour or less in cities. Of course, that's just the noise from normal, well-behaved drivers. Urban noise gets even worse with motorcycles, or with drivers who rev their engines or who drive too fast. And of course, everybody's favorite noise, car alarms. I remember when I was a kid and a car alarm would go off, my mother would yell, "Just hurry up and steal it already!" The truth is that cities aren't loud, cars are loud. And I have a previous video about that if you'd like to learn more. Noise, especially constant daily noise, isn't just annoying, it's also bad for human health, and the paper lists and references several negative health effects of vehicle noise pollution, including cardiovascular disease, high blood pressure, tinnitus, hearing loss, anxiety, stress, sleep disturbance, and cognitive impairment. I wish I could blame cars for the ringing in my ears, but it's almost certainly because I was a rave DJ in the 90s. And rounding out the pollution category, cars and car-centric environments create a lot of light and thermal pollution in cities. Street lights and parking lot lights create light pollution that has been linked to poor sleep quality, and paved surfaces absorb and slowly release heat, making hot weather even hotter through the urban heat island effect, and I talked about that before in my video about bad weather. And of course, there's the big sweaty elephant in the room, climate change. According to the IPCC, the transportation sector accounted for 23% of global energy-related CO2 emissions, and a whopping 70% of that came from road vehicles. But this is only part of the story because this only includes direct emissions from burning fuel. Cars also emit CO2 in their production, maintenance, end of life, and everything related to creating their fuel. Plus, the building and maintenance of car infrastructure, especially concrete and asphalt, also releases large amounts of CO2. Of course, anything we produce at scale in modern society is going to have an impact on the environment, but we should be trying to minimize those effects as much as possible, and human-scale cities do that much better than car-centric cities. As the IPCC states,
compact and walkable urban form enables effective mitigation, while dispersed and autocentric urban form locks in higher levels of energy use.
Suburban sprawl also encourages a sedentary lifestyle, which is known to increase your risk for literally all causes of mortality. Researchers at Stanford estimate that people who live in car-centric places may take as many as 7,000 fewer steps every day compared to someone who lives in a walkable city. That's several kilometers per day, which is a non-trivial amount of activity. The Car Harm paper quotes research calculating that switching from commuting by car to commuting by public transit with no other changes burned an extra 124 kilocalories per day. When you live in a walkable city, you get a base amount of daily exercise without even thinking about it. I've referred to this before as the gym of life, and I have a previous video about that. Car-centric places separate people from each other, increasing social isolation, especially for people who do not drive. Car infrastructure, such as highways and parking lots, separates people literally, but cars also require everything to be farther apart. Humans are social animals, and we are meant to be around other people, and as the paper notes, socially isolated individuals are at an increased risk for development of cardiovascular disease, infectious illness, and cognitive deterioration. Places with more cars also just have fewer people around because people don't like being around a lot of cars. This study from Bristol in the UK found that people who live on streets with higher car traffic have fewer friends and know fewer of their neighbors. This diagram from the paper shows the connections each resident had to other people on each street, and you can see how connections decreased for streets with more car traffic, especially to people living across the road. One resident in the study was quoted,
"The traffic's like a mountain range, cutting you off from the other side of the road."
More cars prevent people from socializing outside of their houses, robbing them of the kind of community that can help them to improve their mental and physical health. The health issues caused by cars and their pollution are very well known and well studied, but they're often shrugged off as natural or inevitable. This effect was studied by researchers in the UK in 2023, and they gave it the name Motonormativity. In one example from the study, 75% of respondents agreed with the statement, "People shouldn't smoke in highly populated areas where other people have to breathe in the cigarette fumes." But only 17% agreed with the statement, "People shouldn't drive in highly populated areas where other people have to breathe in the car fumes." Apparently, the morality of releasing toxic chemicals into the air is dependent on the source of the chemicals. The researchers found that this pro-car bias existed across all demographics, even by people who did not drive. The core assumption here is that driving is inevitable, a necessary evil, if you will, and as a result, the negative health effects of driving are viewed differently than other sources of pollution. We are repeatedly told that cars are an absolute necessity for modern society, and the automobile industry spends more on advertising than almost any other industry. If you're watching this on YouTube, feel free to leave a comment if you get a car ad on this video. You know, those ads that show driving looking like this, when the reality of it is more like this. The only accurate car commercial ever was that Saturn commercial from the 90s that accidentally showed the absurd amount of space that is wasted when everybody gets around by car. From a young age, every one of us is exposed to automobile industry marketing, and car companies pay to have their products appear in every form of media available, including popular music, TV shows, and movies. Many car chase scenes don't happen naturally, they're sponsored by the company that makes the car. It's a car ad embedded inside of the movie. Of course, there are strict laws to ensure that YouTubers properly disclose these kind of sponsorships, but those rules don't apply to movies, but don't get me started on that. But that brings us to an uncomfortable truth about cars. There are a lot of people who make a lot of money ensuring that we all need to buy automobiles and the fuel to go in them. Some of the world's wealthiest people made their fortunes by selling fossil fuels, automobiles, and related products, and these same ultra-wealthy people spent a lot of money on lobbying and political donations to ensure that our cities were designed for their products. Car dependency was not an inevitable natural outcome. It was engineered this way. I have a previous video going through this car infrastructure propaganda film by General Motors that provides some historical context. Everyone is harmed by cars, but the car harm paper lists several demographics who are likely to suffer more than others. They reference several studies showing that children, the elderly, visible minorities, and indigenous people are more likely to be killed by cars. And for decades, car safety systems were built for the average man, and so women are 47% more likely to be seriously injured and 17% more likely to die in a car crash, even after controlling for factors such as height, weight, seatbelt usage, and crash intensity. The paper also notes that traffic crashes are the main cause of injuries and trauma in pregnant women. Cars are very unevenly distributed across the world, with the highest per capita levels of car ownership being in wealthy countries, which makes sense because cars are expensive. The paper references several ways in which car ownership in wealthy countries harms people in countries with the fewest cars, such as the fact that depleted batteries from cars are dismantled in countries with extremely low levels of car ownership, and how people who live in countries with resources that are used by the car industry are exposed to environmental pollution and violence. There is no demographic, though, that has been harmed more by cars than children. The paper mentions that around 700 children are killed every day in car crashes. Safety features like seatbelts and airbags are less effective for children, and children hit by cars are more likely to be killed or seriously injured than adults. Kids who are exposed to high levels of pollution from cars are more likely to develop leukemia and other cancers, and car pollution puts babies at risk of lower birth weights and premature births. Pollution from cars also results in worse mental health outcomes in children, including a potential 70% increase for psychotic experiences. And this study found that nitrogen dioxide pollution from cars contributes to nearly 4 million cases of childhood asthma per year, which is insane. When I was a kid, 58% of children in Canada used to walk or cycle to school. Uphill both ways, of course. Today, that number is 28%. I have mentioned this in previous videos, and Canadians have come up with every possible excuse to explain it. But this is a worldwide phenomenon, and the title of this paper makes it clear: there is too much traffic for Alex to walk to school, so we drive. Here's a stroad next to a high school in the neighborhood where I grew up. I wonder why nobody's walking here. Children across several schools in Switzerland and Liechtenstein were asked to draw their journey to school. Kids who walked to school made drawings like this, showing all of the things they encounter on the way. I love the turtle. But children who were driven to school made drawings like this, which depict details at home and at school, but with little or nothing in between. This last one is particularly depressing, but all of these show that children who are driven to school do not know much about what's in their neighborhood because they never get a chance to see it. In a previous video, I mentioned how our kids loved being in our cargo bike but hated being driven around by car. When I asked them why, the answer was very clear: because this was their view from the cargo bike, but this was their view from the back of the car. Once they were older and could ride to school by themselves, it was very easy for them because they already knew every street and every landmark along the way. Kids can't drive, or at least they shouldn't, and cars are dangerous. So the more car-friendly a place is, the less accessible it is for children, which means that children who live in car-dependent suburbs lack the ability to do their own activities without being driven around by their parents. Unsurprisingly, research has shown that kids in walkable communities get on average 46% more exercise than kids who live in suburban sprawl. Not to mention how boring it is to be a teenager in Suburbia. I firmly believe that walkable neighborhoods are better for children than car-centric suburbs, and I have a previous video about that. Even outside of independent travel for children, cars make cities less accessible in general, and the paper lists several studies that show how car-centric places are less accessible to people with disabilities, as well as studies that show that people with disabilities are more likely to be killed or injured by motor vehicles, despite the fact that these same people are less likely to be able to drive or have a driver's license and be more likely to rely on public transit. In car-centric places, if someone cannot drive for whatever reason, they need to rely on others to shuttle them around, and the paper provides examples of how this can get very expensive, especially if a person needs to rely on taxis or special modifications to their vehicle in order to accommodate their disability. As I've said before, there is no mode of transportation more accessible than a low-floor tram with level boarding. The paper ends this section with a quote from the International Journal of Justice and Sustainability.
Automobility promises the annihilation of distance, but prioritizes some people's journeys at the expense of others. Some distances become larger, as when dual carriageways and fast one-way systems bisect inner city areas, speeding up commuters while forcing local people to detour. Rather than dissolving space, the car economy redistributes it, and most disabled people are among the losers, along with people in poor neighborhoods and children.
People with low income are disproportionately affected by the negative health effects of cars because they can't afford to buy their way out of them. Low-income households are much more likely to live in places with high levels of car traffic and next to highways, because the pollution caused by cars makes housing prices cheaper. And low-income households are less likely to have air conditioning or proper insulation, meaning more exposure to polluted air and noise through open windows. This is especially true in the United States, where highway projects were typically built through low-income and minority communities. My friends over at Segregation by Design have some excellent resources to learn more about this, and they've created some amazing before and after maps showing the destruction caused by highway construction in the U.S. The paper notes that low-income neighborhoods are also less likely to have sidewalks, bicycle lanes, or other safe streets infrastructure, even though the people living there have much lower levels of car ownership because cars are incredibly expensive. In many car-centric cities, but especially in the US, it is becoming increasingly difficult for low-income households to live without a car. In the past, wealthy families left cities for new suburbs, which left low-income people to live in the inner city. These were not necessarily good places to live, but at least they were historic, walkable neighborhoods that were built before cars existed, so people could still get around without a car. But with changing demographics, more investment in cities, and urban propaganda channels like the CityNerd, people are discovering that cities are good places to live, which is gentrifying urban neighborhoods and pushing out lower-income residents. Because we aren't building new walkable urban places to meet demand, we're just improving the few that are left over from 100 years ago. So today, the lowest income neighborhoods in the US are those suburbs built in the 1950s and 1960s that are now run down and no longer desirable. But these are places that were built to be car dependent, and car ownership is required here. To give an idea of the scale of the problem, a report from the Brookings Institute found that between 2000 and 2012, the number of suburban poor living in distressed neighborhoods grew by 139%, which was almost 3 times the pace of growth in cities. Between the upfront cost of a car, maintenance costs, gasoline, and insurance, the average cost of owning a car in the United States is over $12,000 per year, which is why in the US the lowest income households spend an average of 32% of their pre-tax income on transportation. In the EU, total cost of ownership varies between member states, but is typically between $9,000 to $14,000 per year. If you live somewhere with good public transit or cycling infrastructure, car ownership might be optional, but if you live somewhere car dependent, it is not. Car-centric suburbs are engineered so that every single household needs to own and operate at least one motor vehicle just to live. You can't even buy a bag of milk here without a car. Cars and related transportation infrastructure like asphalt are the largest consumers of oil in the world. And the Car Harm paper references a study that estimated that 25 to 50% of all inter-country wars since 1973 were started due to access to oil. The cost of those wars and military actions that are totally not wars, guys, is staggering in terms of both human lives and money. This isn't just the car's fault, but it's not the car's fault either, right? Drivers often complain how expensive it is to own a car, and there is a common belief that drivers are subsidizing everybody else. I used to live in the UK, and motorists there would routinely complain how unfair it was that cyclists didn't need to pay any road tax. The truth is that driving is expensive simply because cars and car infrastructure are ridiculously expensive, and despite the costs that drivers pay, it is drivers who are subsidized. Even in countries with high taxes on fuel and automobiles, especially once you include the cost of local streets and roads within cities. The Car Harm paper references a study in Australia which found that only 1/6 of the total cost of automobility are paid for by motorists, with the rest being paid for by society. A German study that estimated that 30 to 40% of the total cost of a car was paid for by government subsidies and a higher price of goods and services for everyone, even people who don't drive. And an EU study that calculated that for every kilometer driven, cars cost society 11 cents, while walking and cycling actually benefit society once health effects are included. There are so many direct and indirect ways that driving is subsidized. Consider a car crash. Within a short period of time, dozens of emergency workers will show up: police, ambulance, firefighters, the injured will be taken to hospital, damage to the road and surrounding buildings will be repaired. This costs millions of dollars every time it happens, and everybody pays for it, not just drivers. Of course, to reduce the number of crashes and the loss of life, every city employs a whole team of police officers to enforce traffic laws. Drivers don't pay for this either. Everybody does. Car parking, though, is one of the worst examples of automobile subsidies. It is extremely common for cities to have laws that require a minimum number of parking spaces to be provided. These minimum parking requirements are particularly bad in US and Canadian cities, which is why it's common to see parking lots that are larger than the shops they're attached to, and in almost all cases, this parking is completely free. The owner of the store has to pay for the construction, maintenance, and property taxes on this land, so the price of everything in the store has to be a little bit higher to cover the cost of the free parking. But groceries are the same price whether you walk or drive, so people who do not drive subsidize the people who do. This is also a major reason why many US and Canadian downtowns are hollowed out, because in order for a business to open, they would need to ensure that there are enough off-street parking spaces available to meet requirements. The downtown of my hometown looks like this, because dozens of historic buildings were bulldozed in order to provide enough parking spaces for all the cars. These hidden societal costs of parking have been well documented in the book The High Cost of Free Parking by Donald Shoup. One example from the book is the Disney Concert Hall built in downtown Los Angeles. In order to meet minimum parking requirements, a $100 million parking garage was built, paid for by the Los Angeles County through the sale of public bonds. As a result, the orchestra was required to increase the number of performances to a minimum of 120 concerts per year to generate enough parking garage revenue just to service the debt on the construction of that parking lot. If you want to learn more about how much parking costs society, my friends over at Climate Town made a full video about it that is definitely worth a watch, and I'll leave a link in the description. Parking also increases the cost of new housing because the cost of the parking is rolled into the cost of the housing. For multi-level parking garages, every parking spot adds $25,000 to $75,000 in cost. The Car Harm paper references a specific example of an affordable housing development in California where parking raised construction costs by 38%. The housing crisis in Canada is one of the worst in the world, but whenever I've seen new housing projects proposed, the same concerns were brought up every time. Where will these new people park? How much more traffic will this development create? These objections happen in cities everywhere, and in some cases, concerns about traffic and parking kill the project completely. Cars take up a lot of space, which means that car-friendly places push everything farther apart. For every kilometer of road or parking lot, the city needs to put an additional kilometer of electrical wire, water pipes, sewage pipes, and asphalt. Costs for other services, such as garbage collection and emergency services, also increase as destinations are pushed farther apart. But these same sprawling neighborhoods also collect less tax revenue because there are fewer people and fewer businesses in a given area. The result is that car-centric places are unable to afford the replacement cost of their infrastructure, and even wealthy suburbs rely on subsidies from dense urban areas in order to stay financially solvent. Car infrastructure is horrendously expensive, and automobile projects put a strain on transportation budgets, leaving less money for much more cost-effective and financially responsible infrastructure projects for walking, cycling, and public transit. I've seen people up in arms about the cost of modest bike lane projects that cost tens of thousands of dollars. But think about how many traffic lights you pass as you travel through your city, and then realize that every single one of those installations costs around $250,000, and sometimes up to $500,000 for more complex installations. The astronomically high cost of new road and highway projects is often justified by questionable calculations of how much traffic congestion is costing people through wasted time and lost productivity. Funny how those same calculations are never used to justify building public transit. They're only ever used to justify building more of the highways that created those traffic congestion costs in the first place. It's insane that Highway 401 through Toronto is the busiest highway in all of North America, and yet it moves fewer people per day than Line 1 of the Toronto subway. Not the whole subway system, just Line 1. Of course, the part that is rarely accounted for when talking about road infrastructure is the replacement cost of the infrastructure at the end of its life, which will inevitably cost more than it did to build it. For example, the construction of the Gardiner Expressway in Toronto cost about $1 billion to build in today's money. But decades later, when it was crumbling and pieces were literally falling off of it, the government had to spend over $5 billion to rehabilitate just part of it. Ultimately, cities pay for these large infrastructure projects with debt and the promise of future growth to pay back that debt, which is becoming a serious financial problem for many cities, especially in the US. This is the core message of Strong Towns, a nonprofit organization in the United States that has studied this effect extensively in hundreds of towns and cities over the past decade. I have a playlist of videos from the early days of this channel that explain the research of Strong Towns, and I'll leave a link to it in the description. One analysis I find particularly interesting is that of Urban3, a consulting company that works with municipalities in the US and Canada. They have created maps of cities they've worked with to show which neighborhoods are financially productive and which require subsidies to operate. This analysis consistently reveals that traditional walkable neighborhoods subsidize car-centric places, especially wealthy car-dependent suburbs. I made a video about Urban3 and I'll leave a link to that in the description. One of the fundamental problems is that car-centric development encourages bad land use. Ontario, Canada, where I'm from, destroyed an average of 319 acres of farmland per day between 2016 and 2021. Yeah, Canada is big, but it doesn't have an infinite amount of good farmland, especially good farmland that's close to cities. The Car Harm paper also notes that low-density developments and roads are the primary drivers of habitat disruption and a reduction in biodiversity. They estimate that the number of vertebrates, what most people would just call animals, that are killed by cars each year to be over 1 billion. They also reference that sprawling developments increase the risk and costs of forest fires, and that asphalt and other impermeable surfaces increase the number and severity of floods. This bad land use is also the reason why reliable public transit is not feasible in car-centric places, and I've talked about that before in a previous video. The paper notes that one car passenger consumes as much space as nearly 20 bus passengers and has an interesting way of expressing space in terms of meters squared per hour per person for each mode of travel. Regardless of how it's calculated, though, cars are an incredibly inefficient way to transport people through cities, and if left unchecked, they will consume all of the space between buildings. Of course, many cities solve this problem by knocking down the buildings to give the cars more space. Isn't it beautiful? There are very few buildings to go to anymore, but at least there's plenty of parking. For any entrepreneur, it is much easier to start a business and for that business to be sustainable in a place with a lot of foot traffic, which is why walkable urban neighborhoods are more interesting than car-centric suburbs. Tokyo is a dense city, well known for having a variety of extremely specialized small businesses. Menswear expert Derek Guy has mentioned many times before that Tokyo has hundreds of unique clothing and shoe options available. And that's because these craftsmen and women are able to operate their highly specialized stores because they can keep their costs down by renting small urban spaces for their shop, living nearby, and relying on foot traffic for business. By comparison, retail and restaurant options in car-dependent suburbia are mostly limited to established big box stores and chain restaurants that are able to rely on brand recognition to fill the parking lots. Of course, big box stores create a lot more problems for cities, but I have a previous video about that already. Space is a precious resource within cities, and so it always pains me to see it covered by asphalt. Which is why I so often feature those cities that are reclaiming space from cars to make the city better for the people who live there. Which finally brings us to the topic that I talk about more often than anything else on this channel. Urban places are fundamentally better when there are fewer cars. I've been to hundreds of cities around the world and I've seen the same thing everywhere, which is why I've started to call it the universal law of cities, which states, the more car-friendly a place is, the shittier it is to be there. Even at the best of times, cars are loud, dangerous, and they take up a lot of space, so people don't feel comfortable hanging around in places with lots of cars. But this shouldn't really be a surprise, because the truth is, everybody hates cars, or rather, everybody hates other people's cars. Even people who drive everywhere and like driving hate it when there are too many other people's cars around. Other people's cars creating traffic. Other people's cars filling up parking spaces. Other people's cars driving too fast down their street. That's why car-dependent suburbs have these curvy, windy streets and full of stop signs. They're specifically designed so that driving here is inefficient, to discourage other people's cars from driving through my neighborhood. And it's why houses on dead ends and cul-de-sac are the most desirable, even for suburbanites, because there's less car traffic from other people's cars. We can't build our way out of this. Widening roads and building new highways has been shown to induce travel demand for automobiles, and building sprawling car infrastructures is not financially viable anyway, even before you factor in all of the negative effects of cars on our health and well-being. As the Car Harm paper puts it,
while some people benefit from automobility, nearly everyone, whether or not they drive, is harmed by it. Slowing automobility's violence and pollution will be impracticable without the replacement of policies that encourage car harm with policies that reduce it.
So the paper ends with a list of interventions that have been proven to reduce car use and some of their negative health effects. This list includes congestion charges and road pricing, removing most on-street parking, replacing minimum parking requirements with maximum parking limits, building car-free and nearly car-free areas, reducing speed limits, converting parking into mixed-use developments, and encouraging the use of bicycles, e-bikes, micromobility, and car sharing as alternatives. These are all topics that I have talked about multiple times on this channel, and not even because I want to eliminate cars, but because I want cities to be better. I have heard from literally hundreds of self-described car people who are fans of this channel, because it's not about whether or not you love cars or hate cars, it's about having healthier, more livable cities and a choice of how you get around. Ultimately, it really is about freedom, the freedom to not to have to drive. There are a lot of people who want to live without a car. Research from just this year in the car-loving USA found that nearly 1/5 of adults who currently own a car showed a very strong desire to live car-free, and an additional 40% were open to the idea. It would be crazy not to make it possible for some of those people to do that. Even if you love driving, wouldn't it be great if you could take an enjoyable walk to many of your daily destinations whenever you wanted to? If your kids could ride their bikes or take public transit to where they're going without you having to be their chauffeur? If your elderly parents who really shouldn't be driving could get around safely by themselves? And if people with a wide range of disabilities could do the same without needing other people to shuttle them around? And wouldn't it be great if, when you genuinely did need to drive, there were fewer other people's cars on the road so that your drive was more efficient and less stressful? And wouldn't it be great if your city was quieter, cleaner, safer, healthier, friendlier, more social, and more enjoyable? Cars were a revolutionary invention. There is no denying that. But in our excitement to usher in this new technology, we completely ripped up the way our cities had worked for thousands of years. And the results have not been positive. It's not that cars aren't useful, they absolutely are. But cars cause a lot of serious problems too. Both of these statements can be true. It is stupid to say that we should ban all cars everywhere. But it is equally stupid to allow people to drive whatever they want, wherever they want, whenever they want, and to allow cars to consume so much space in our cities and to cause so much damage to our health and well-being. The most frustrating part to me, though, is that cars aren't nearly as necessary as we've been led to believe. There are certainly some cases where people need a motor vehicle, but after traveling the world and living in dozens of different cities, I am absolutely convinced that if our cities were designed properly, the majority of people could live without a car, just like our family does, and their lives would actually be better as a result. And ultimately, this is the reason why this channel exists, and it's why I spend so much time talking about the cities that have made it possible to live a happy, healthy life without a car. We need to start treating cars like a tool that can be useful, but that can also be dangerous and destructive, especially when used too much. Or worse, when they become the only option available. So they're a tool we need to use carefully when absolutely necessary, and only after trying better solutions first. Because I can tell you from experience, the absolute best kind of urban places are those where cars aren't even needed at all. If you want to learn more about how cities could be better, I've provided links to several relevant Not Just Bikes videos in the description, as well as links to other great urbanist creators including City Beautiful, a professor of urban planning with a talent for teaching, and CityNerd, a former traffic engineer and urban planner who masterfully delivers deadpan humor in highly researched videos. Most of these videos are on YouTube, but the best place to watch them is on Nebula. There's a whole section on Nebula that's dedicated to urbanism that includes videos by urbanist creators, as well as videos by other creators when they cover urbanist topics. And if you can, I'd really encourage you to watch these videos on Nebula because it directly supports the creators. This isn't an advertisement or a paid sponsorship, it's just fact. I would not be able to afford to make the videos that I do if it wasn't for the support that I get from Nebula. In fact, Nebula recently helped me to finance and produce a brand new show called Day Pass, which is available now on Nebula. Day Pass is a travel show where I take you around a city to see interesting urbanist and cultural locations while also riding as much public transit as possible. I'm really happy with the way Day Pass turned out, and I think it's a great example of a show that wouldn't be possible without Nebula. And that's because Nebula is a streaming service that's owned and operated by creators, not venture capitalists, private equity, or big tech. Which is why Nebula can afford to support creators and provide a platform for them to make the videos they want to make without worrying about demonetization or algorithmic optimization. When you sign up to Nebula, you not only support this channel and get early access to all of my future videos, you also get access to thousands of videos from over 250 other talented creators, all without any ads or sponsorships. You'll also get access to Nebula Originals, which includes unique shows like Day Pass, but also documentary films and many other videos that are only available on Nebula. It's amazing what can be accomplished when you cut big tech out of the picture. Nebula also has gift cards, and my Dutch viewers will be glad to know that you can buy them with Ideal. You can even send one to yourself if you just want to try Nebula without using a credit card. So if you want to support a streaming service with lots of original high-quality videos that's also dedicated to making creators the best that they can be, then consider signing up to Nebula. If you sign up using the link go.nebula.tv/notjustbikes or buy a gift card at gift.nebula.tv/notjustbikes, then you'll support this channel financially and get 50% off an annual subscription. Thanks to everyone who supports this channel on Nebula, on Patreon, or even here on YouTube by watching this video all the way through to the end. I appreciate it.